One final Civil War related thing that we're going to look at that took place during this time period is what was going on in the Southwest with the Apaches and the Navajos. Now, Apaches and Navajos both speak an Athabascan language and probably migrated into the region roughly somewhere 7, 8, 900 years ago. I say they spoke Athabascan languages. The Apache name for themselves is Inde. The Navajo name for themselves is Diné, which is all the same letters, just arranged differently. There are some similarities culturally as well. But we're going to first look at the Apaches. The Apaches lived in the Apacheria, which essentially just means the homeland of the Apaches. Now, I said that their word for themselves is Inde, which means the people. Apache was a term that was applied to them by the Spanish, probably taken from the word for Apaches from some of their neighboring tribes. The Apaches were in conflict with the Spanish from the time the Spanish showed up in the area in the 1500s and would continue to be so for a very long time until eventually New Spain became Mexico. Now here in this map you can see the major groupings of the Apaches. We're going to be looking particularly at the Chiricahua Apaches. And here is a close-up of the region where the Chiricahuas in particular were there, where southern Arizona and New Mexico come together and down into Mexico. This map, by the way, has a lot of spoilers on it for events that will happen after the Civil War that we'll be talking about later. So I'll probably come back to this map. And finally, this map, which is a zoom out, to give you an idea, a clearer idea of the neighbors of the Apaches, as well as to enable us to see some of the subgroupings of Apaches, like, for example, the Mimbreño. You'll see there that sort of in between the Chiricahua and Mescalero. The Mimbreño are going to be closely allied with the Chiricahua and eventually virtually absorbed into the Chiricahua groups. But I needed you to see where those folks are, the Mimbreño in particular, because we'll be talking about a very prominent member of that group very soon, within minutes, in fact. The Apaches had sort of a tentative peace with Spain, however, starting in the early 1790s, that would last for several decades until Mexico broke away from Spain and became its own independent country, which happened in 1821. You see, now that Mexico was an independent republic, no longer connected to Spain, which, even though it was faltering, was still a global power, they didn't have as much money anymore. The government of Mexico, that is, and so they couldn't afford as many soldiers. And at the same time, they saved money by cutting out the food deliveries to the presidios where the Apaches had agreed to go and live in return for annuities being paid to them by the Spanish government, which now were supposed to be taken over by the Mexican government, but they didn't do it. So therefore, the Apaches from these various different groupings left those presidios and resumed their hunter-gatherer tradition because they had to eat. Now, about 10 years after the independence of Mexico was declared, the governor of the Mexican state of Chihuahua declared war on the Apaches for having left the presidio and opened hostilities with the various Apache groups, which turns out to have been not a very good idea. So After about 30 or 40 actually years of relative peace, the next 20 years were going to be very violent there in along the what would later be the U.S.-Mexican border between the Mexicans and the Apaches. As the 1830s wore on, the Mexican government actually started offering bounties for the scalps of adult Apache men and smaller bounties for the capture of women and children. Now, one problem there is if you have a group of people where both the men and the women tend to have long hair and it tends to be the same color, what's to stop the unscrupulous person who's already unscrupulous enough to be a scalp hunter to be killing women as well as men? Well, nothing. And so that intensified the violence. Eventually, the price, the bounty for those scalps increased from 100 pesos to 200 pesos, which was a pretty good bit of money at the time. And the 1830s got increasingly bloody. And that is when Mongus coloratus enters our story. This photograph, by the way, is a photograph of Mongus coloratus, but it's not really a photograph of Mongus coloratus in the sense that it's not a photograph of the person we're talking about, but rather of his grown son many years later. However, we have no photographs of Mongus coloratus Sr., so this is the closest I could come. Mongus coloratus, by the way, is Spanish for red sleeves. He favored red shirts. Mongus coloratus was a Mimbreño Apache. Remember, they were closely allied with the Chiricahua. In fact, several of his daughters married Chiricahua husbands. Well, Mongus coloratus became one of the more prominent Apache leaders in the area in the late 1830s. And he led a lot of raids. He killed several trappers. In one case, there was a small mining community that had 300 or 400 Mexican people living there working in the mines, whom he chased off and killed most of them. So things were continuing to step up there in the area. As we discussed back in lecture video number 32, the United States went to war with Mexico in 1846, and the fighting lasted for 2 years. The U.S. won, and at the end of the war, took this whole area that you see on the map here in orange away from Mexico and made it part of the United States. And that includes a big chunk of the territory inhabited by the Chiricahua Apaches and other Apache groups as well. Now, the Apaches, particularly in what would later be Arizona and New Mexico, generally speaking, were okay with the United States taking over because they weren't too fond of Mexico anymore. Not that they ever had been real fond of them to start with. So there was this feeling among many Apaches, hey, things are going to get better for us now because we're not going to be dealing with that Mexican government. Wonder how that turned out. Well, initially it worked out okay. The Chiricahuas and Mescaleros continued going across the border to fight Mexicans, but generally speaking, everything was cool between them and the Norte Americanos for the first few years. The Chiricahuas even gave permission for the Butterfield stage line to run through their territory. That was a stagecoach company that carried mail and passengers from Memphis to San Francisco. So things were relatively peaceful north of the border throughout the decade of the 1850s. Until gold was discovered. right here in the Pinos Altos Mountains, smack dab in the middle of Chiricahua territory. And, as is usually the case, white people came streaming in and, generally speaking, were not necessarily well behaved. Within a very short time, in 1860, a mining town was formed that would come to be known also as Pinos Altos, which means tall pines. According to some sources, Mangus Coloradus, who was getting close to 70 years old by this time, actually visited that mining town to tell the miners that he knew a place where they could find even more of this yellow iron that they were so fond of. After all, he knew the whole region really well. And so he was going to direct them to a place farther to the north outside of Chiricahua territory. However, they thought it would be fun to grab him and beat him up and tie him to a post and whip him with a horsewhip. May have been fun for them in the moment. Clearly wasn't very fun for him, but the fun was going to stop for them before too much longer. Now we're going to take a moment to talk about these two Apache men who were closely associated with Mangus Coloradus. This is actually a photograph of some statues in a museum exhibit, and the reason that I went with this instead of a photograph is there are no photographs of Cochise, and the photographs we have of Geronimo are from about 25 years later when he was in his mid-50s. At the time period we're talking about, the early 1860s, Geronimo was in his early to mid-20s, and Cochise was about 55 years old. Cochise was the leader of his band of Chiricahuas and was the son-in-law of Mangus Coloradus, who was about 12 years older than he was. Mangus Coloradus, as I mentioned, was in his late 60s. Geronimo was actually named Goyathle, which means he yawns, or the yawner. I'll tell you in a moment how he got his name. Geronimo was a warrior who had originally lived south of the border in the Mexican part of the Chiricahua territory. And on a particular occasion, the Mexican army, while Geronimo and most of the warriors were away from their camp, about 400 Mexican soldiers, came into the camp and killed pretty much everybody that was there, including Geronimo's wife and all their children and his mother. Now, for one thing, after that, he went northward and joined up with Mangus Coloradus. For another thing, he never liked Mexicans after that. Again, not that he liked them that much before, but he had a special and intense hatred for Mexicans that he did not necessarily have for Anglos. Well, Geronimo, like I said, was a young warrior. Cochise was a bit older. They are both essentially going to be lieutenants of Mangus Coloradus, though Cochise, more than a lieutenant, a co-leader eventually. Cochise, by the way, his name means oak tree. Now, Goyathle, in one of the raids that he participated in south of the border, in which he and the Apaches with him were killing a bunch of Mexican people, a Mexican man, and remember Mexicans at this time mostly were Roman Catholic, Mexican man that he was attacking, cried out to Saint Jerome to save him. Now, Saint Jerome, Jerome is in Spanish, Geronimo. So he's yelling, Geronimo, and the other Apaches, I guess, maybe thought that was funny. And so they started calling their friend that, and it stuck. So that's how he came to have this actually Spanish name. Now I want to pause for a moment and point something out. Now I was born in 1968, and when I was a kid in the 1970s and up into the 80s, everyone knew who Geronimo was, but everyone also knew who Cochise was because back then everybody watched old westerns, and Cochise was showing up in western movies constantly, as well as in western novels and comic books, probably more so than Geronimo back then. As you can see, why he even met John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. Um, Over the last 15 years, though, since I've been teaching, when I ask students about Geronimo and Cochise, most of them have at least heard of Geronimo, but I don't think I've had one student in 15 years that had heard of Cochise before they took my class, which the first time I asked that question and no one knew who he was, it blew my mind. That's one of those things that I just thought everybody knew, but apparently not anymore. However, you've heard of him now. Now, Cochise had maintained fairly friendly relations with the United States, with the Norte Americanos. He may have been accused of taking some cattle here and there, but nothing beyond that. Until January 27th, 1861, when at the ranch of a man named John Ward in southern Arizona, and you can see there on the map the blue house there, that's the Ward Ranch. The ranch was attacked by Apaches who took several head of his cattle and captured his, I think, 12-year-old Mexican stepson, Felix, and absconded with him. Now, the Apaches in question were actually Coyotero Apaches who were part of the Western Apaches. However, when they left from the ranch, they were riding due east, and so it was assumed they must be Chiricahuas. The colonel commanding nearby Fort Buchanan ordered Lieutenant George Bascom to take about 50 men and do whatever was necessary to retrieve the lost boy and to punish the attackers. Editorial note, this is actually a picture of Fort Defiance, Arizona, and the photograph is of George Bascom after he was promoted to captain. We do the best we can. Bascom and his men went due east to Apache Pass, where they met with Sergeant Daniel Robinson, a scout who had established communications with Cochise and relayed the message that Lieutenant Bascom expected Cochise to report to his camp for interrogation. Now, Cochise was somewhat doubtful of the lieutenant's intentions. He brought with him his brother and two nephews, and his own wife and children. Now, that sort of an action usually indicates that someone is on a mission of peace and has no intention of war. Well, Cochise and his family were brought into the command tent to meet with Lieutenant Bascom, whereupon Cochise was told that he must immediately turn over the missing boy, and Cochise responded, I have no idea what you're talking about. However, if some boy has been taken by some other Apache band, I'd be happy to sort of put the word out and see what I can find out and maybe try to help you find him. Whereupon Lieutenant Bascom told him that he was a liar and ordered his soldiers to arrest all the Apaches in the tent. Now, Cochise at this point took his knife and cut very quickly a large slit in the back of the tent and slipped through it, escaping with his life. However, the rest of his family was captured. He was told by messengers from Bascom that he could have his family back when he returned the missing boy, which of course is going to be problematic. Cochise at this point raided about 2 days later, February 5th. Cochise and his Apaches attacked a group of Teamsters, about a dozen Teamsters. By the way, if you're listening to this and you don't know what a Teamster is, that's people who drive wagons, usually supply wagons. So these dozen Teamsters, 3 of them were Anglos and 9 of them were Mexicans. Cochise and his men tortured and killed the Mexicans because they were Mexicans, but kept the 3 Anglos alive to trade for his family. Whereupon he was told, no, that won't work. You have to turn over the boy or we're going to kill your family. Well, this is not going to end well, is it? Cochise and his men attacked Bascom's soldiers and then fled southward at a rapid pace toward Mexico. Along the way, they slowed down their rapid pace long enough to torture and kill their 3 American hostages, leaving their bodies where they could easily be found by the pursuing cavalry soldiers. Shortly after that, Cochise's brother and his 2 nephews, the sons of his brother, were hanged by the U.S. Army, although his wife and children were released unharmed. This whole incident became known to Americans as the Bascom Affair. It became known to Apaches as the Cuts the Tent Affair. But whatever you call it, it was the beginning of 25 years of warfare between the United States government and the Chiricahua Apaches. Meanwhile, Felix Tellez, the stepson of John Ward, who had been captured by Coyotero Apaches, was traded to White Mountain Apaches who adopted him and finished raising him. And he lived among the White Mountain Apaches for the next 11 years, after which, in 1872, at the age of 23, he joined the U.S. Cavalry as an Apache Indian scout. Now, the other troopers could not pronounce his Apache name, and they couldn't really even pronounce his Spanish name, so they gave him a nickname, Mickey Free, who was a supporting character in a popular novel called Charles O'Malley, the Irish Dragoon. So, for the rest of his life, he was known to Norte Americanos as Mickey Free, and he served as an Apache scout for 20 years, during which time he was involved in several prominent and famous actions. So far as I know, nobody, after Mickey Free showed up and told everyone who he really was, I'm not aware that anybody ever went to the Chiricahuas and apologized for the slight mix-up. Cochise joined forces with his father-in-law, Mangus Colorados, and by this time Geronimo had joined them, as well as they had allied with the Mescalero Apaches to their east, and they struck out against several targets, both military and civilian, in the region, including virtually wiping out the little mining town of Pinos Altos, where Mangus Colorados had been so horribly mistreated a few months or so before. Well, before very long, the U.S. Army withdrew from the region, and Cochise and the others initially thought, well, I guess we showed them. But in reality, it was by this time the spring of 1861, and the U.S. Army suddenly had other things to do back east. As you probably are aware, the Civil War started around this time. And after the U.S. forces withdrew, Confederate forces occupied Arizona and essentially took over. The Arizona Confederates were commanded by General John Baylor, who immediately declared himself the territorial governor of Arizona. So you've got the Confederate Army in charge now. Are they going to be any easier to deal with than the U.S. Army had been, at least so far as Apaches were concerned? Well, Baylor outlined his plan for the Apaches. His plan was to send word to all the Apaches that he wanted to meet with them and parley with them, negotiate with them, and once they came in, kill them all. Kill all the adults, men and women, but not to kill the children because we're going to sell them as slaves. Well, it's not very often that I find anything good to say about Jefferson Davis, but at least in this case, he thought that was a horrible idea. He was mortified at the idea of intentionally lying and luring in the Apaches with the thought beforehand to murder all of them. And he actually transferred Baylor out of Arizona. Not long after that, the U.S. Army returned to Arizona and transferred all the Confederates out of Arizona. The Union troops who drove the Confederates out of Arizona Territory were led by Colonel James Henry Carleton of Maine. The troops had marched from California into Arizona Territory, and as you can see in the map here, after chasing the Confederates out, the Union now has control of Arizona Territory. The Confederates still, at least for the moment, in charge of New Mexico Territory, despite having lost that Battle of Glorieta Pass there a little bit earlier. Carleton had about 2,500 men. As they were preparing to march eastward to pursue the Confederates into New Mexico Territory, they were confronted by the fact that this is desert area, desert region. And so Carleton sent a force ahead of the main force of about 150 men with two cannon with them into Apache Pass to check out the springs, the Apache springs that were located there, to determine whether or not there was enough water there to take care of their whole force and enable them to keep traveling eastward. So that small force went into Apache Pass, and you may recall this map from just a few minutes ago. They went right over the area there where the Bascom affair had taken place 2 years earlier. And clearly the Chiricahuas had not forgotten about the Bascom affair because they were there waiting for them. At least a couple of hundred Apaches, maybe more. Cochise was there, Mangus Colorados was there, Geronimo was there. They opened fire on the troopers, and it was pretty withering fire. However, the soldiers were able to fall back and take shelter in the abandoned Butterfield stage station. So they had some cover there, and they were able to return fire. Then they broke their cannons out and started firing those cannon at the Apaches to devastating effect. In fact, when the Apaches later said, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, we were doing fine until they started shooting wagons at us. The Apaches were in fact driven back. Mangus Colorados was seriously wounded with a bullet to the chest, and the soldiers were able then to make their way to Apache Springs and get the water that they needed, and determine that yes, indeed, this is going to be the proper route for the main force to take. By the way, I misspoke there just a minute or two ago. I was thrown off by the fact that that map said 1863. The arrival of Carleton was in 1862, and the Battle of Apache Pass was over a 2-day period in the middle of July of 1862. After his men's battle with Cochise and Mangus Colorados at Apache Pass, James Henry Carleton, Colonel Carleton, who had become Brigadier General Carleton, and his men pushed on eastward into New Mexico, his California troops, where they met up with other Union troops, and together they defeated the Confederates there in southern New Mexico and West Texas and pushed them out completely of New Mexico, after which Carleton was made the head of the Department of New Mexico. All the other Union troops went back to the east to continue fighting against Confederates there, led by, I believe, General Canby. But Carleton and his Californians remained in New Mexico, and now he was given a new set of orders to defeat the Apaches and the Navajos. The Apaches, particularly the Mescalero Apaches, who by this time were being led principally by Mangas Colorados, and of course the Chiricahuas being led by Cochise. And then you have the Navajo, who are there in the northern part of New Mexico and Arizona. General Carleton decided to turn his attention first to the Apaches. A little bit later, when he turned his attention to the Navajos, he would employ another set of troops, New Mexico Union troops, led by someone that we have already talked about before. And that is Colonel Christopher Kit Carson, a famous mountain man and fur trapper and guide for wagon trains and various other things down through the years. Active, he's in his late 50s now, so he had been a fur trapper starting in his late teens. He had served in the U.S.-Mexican War, and we talked about him in lecture video number 37 when we talked about the Battle of Adobe Walls, which is where Carson and his men fought a much larger force of Comanches, Kiowas, and Plains Apaches in the ruins of the old Adobe trading post operated for many years by William Bent. Now, that battle is at this time about a year in the future. So that's going to take place after the events that we're about to discuss. When I talked about Carson and his men before, I don't think I mentioned that his New Mexico Union troops were mostly Hispanic. So anyhow, Carson is going to be taking the lead against the Navajos. However, Carleton decides to set his sights first on the Apaches, particularly the Mescalero Apaches. Now, to start preparation for what Carleton was certain would be his ultimate victory over the Navajos and Apaches, he had his men build a fort called Fort Sumner. Now, that's not Fort Sumter in South Carolina, where the Civil War had started in the spring of 1861. This is Fort Sumner. Sometimes I hear people referring to that South Carolina fort as Fort Sumner, but no, Fort Sumner is in New Mexico. Anyhow, the fort was near a place called Bosque Redondo, which is where Carleton intended to forcibly relocate the Apaches and Navajos after he defeated them, despite the fact that early on he was told that this area was not an area that was really very capable of sustaining life for a large concentrated number of people. Well, how's that gonna stop him? Anyhow, he sets about then to make sure that he's got some people to put in this really terrible desert-like place. Now, here's how Carleton intended to deal with the Apaches. As we know from his own words, in orders given to his men on October 12, 1862, speaking of the Mescalero Apaches, quote, "All Indian men of that tribe are to be killed whenever and wherever you can find them. The women and children will not be harmed, but you will take them prisoners and feed them at Fort Stanton until you receive other instructions about them. If the Indians send in a flag and desire to treat for peace, say to the bearer that you have no power to make peace, that you are there to kill them wherever you can find them." End quote. And he meant it. In January 1863, Mangus Colorados came in under a white flag of truce, hoping to negotiate with some California, with a California regiment commanded by a colonel named West. He came in with his white flag and was immediately taken prisoner. He was taken prisoner. He was bound. Guards were set to watch him overnight, and the colonel said to those guards, essentially, this man is going to be dead before morning. So he was actually tortured through the night by red-hot bayonets that had been held in a fire and then pressed against him, jabbed into him, until finally he was killed, allegedly attempting to escape despite the fact he was tied up. After he was killed, his head was cut off by the soldiers who boiled it, boiled all the flesh off of it, rendered it down to a skull, which they sent to the Smithsonian Institution. And that was the very ignominious end of Mangus Colorados. This did not make the other Apaches any more fond of the United States Army, but this, coupled with the defeats that had been handed out to the Mescaleros, led the other Mescaleros to, in a large group, surrender, which they were safer doing, I believe, in a large group rather than individually, because they were not all killed. Instead, they were taken to that Bosque Redondo place. The Chiricahuas did not surrender. In fact, Geronimo actually took his people and went southward back across the border into the Mexican state of Sonora to continue his war against the Mexicans. But Cochise continued fighting against the U.S. government for 10 more years in Arizona and New Mexico. Finally, in 1872, he signed a peace treaty and agreed to go with his people to the Chiricahua reservation that was set up for them. Not the Bosque Redondo thing, that was a thing of the past by then. So Cochise, 1872, his war finally was over. Several other Apache leaders who had served with Mangus Colorados throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s also continued the struggle after his death and after the Mescaleros were sent to the Bosque Redondo. For example, there was Nana, which in English translates into Nana, or Grandma, which he was an older guy. That may have been where he got that name, despite the fact that he was older than some of the others, more akin to the age of Cochise or Mangus Colorados. He was married to one of Geronimo's sisters. Also, there was who had grown up with Geronimo. And there was Victorio, who, unlike the other two, was Chihende or Mimbreño or Warm Springs Apache. And Victorio happened to be another son-in-law of Mangus Colorados. So in other words, he was the brother-in-law of Cochise, and Nana was the brother-in-law of Geronimo, who probably stopped fighting, J-U-H, probably stopped fighting around the same time that Cochise did. However, Victorio and Nana continued their war against the United States and Mexico into the 1880s, and we'll be talking more about Victorio later on. I mentioned that Cochise signed a peace treaty in 1872. Only 2 years after that, in 1874, he died of abdominal cancer. He was in his late 60s. He died and he was buried in his beloved Dragoon Mountains in an area that today is known as the Cochise Stronghold. And only the people who took his body to be buried ever knew exactly where in those mountains he was buried, because they did not want his body being disturbed by relic seekers or by white people looking for revenge after his death, which actually had happened with many native leaders. So, just as we have no images of Cochise taken from life, this is an imagined portrait of him, so also there is no grave of Cochise for anyone to visit. It's like he passed straight from the living leader that he was and into myth and legend with nothing physical left behind. Well, let's get back to General Carleton, Colonel Kit Carson, and the Navajos. Here we see the traditional Navajo homeland in Arizona and New Mexico. The Apache homeland was called the Apacheria. The Navajo homeland is called by the Navajo the Dineta. Remember, the Navajos' name for themselves is Dine, so the Dineta. General Carleton stated that the most humane approach to the Navajos was to be as extremely severe with them as possible. No kidding, he actually said that. And severe he was, and severe Colonel Carson was under his command. The attacks against the Navajo raiders were a scorched earth policy, basically. The U.S. Army came in and killed people left and right and destroyed everything in their path until the Navajos no longer had the means or the will to resist, which didn't take long because a whole lot of them were killed. And then finally, the Navajos surrendered at the Canyon de Chelly, there in the heart of the Dineta. Of course, General Carleton had long since decided that the Navajos were not going to be allowed to remain in their homeland, but that rather they were going to be removed to the reservation at Bosque Redondo, which was about 40 square miles, which, as you can see here on the map, is a whole lot smaller than the area that they were coming from. Well, beginning in August of 1864, under the direction of troops commanded by Carson, the Navajo were in fact forcibly marched 300 miles from Fort Defiance to Fort Sumner at Bosque Redondo. 300 miles, that is not an afternoon jaunt, if you take into account the fact that well, it started in August, really picked up a little bit later. This is very similar to the Trail of Tears in that it wasn't a matter of everybody all at once in one big mass being sent, but rather sort of in stages, in groups, and the majority of them were making this march in the wintertime through a desert. So, as you can imagine, particularly when you've got soldiers forcing you along, that is a very unpleasant experience. It came to be known to the Navajos as the Long Walk. They were not told where they were going. They were not told how long it was going to take to get there. They were not told what was going to happen to them when they did get there. They were told, essentially, to walk. Between 3,500 and 4,500 Navajos died on that walk of exposure or starvation, of freezing. Most of them died on the journey. Many of them also died once they got there, which when they did arrive, there were about 9 or 10,000 survivors who did arrive at Bosque Redondo, that 40 square miles of desert, which was not really a place that could sustain that many people. Plus, there were already about 500 Mescalero Apaches who had been confined there at the Bosque Redondo. And the Mescalero Apaches and Navajos passionately hated one another, so that when the Navajos arrived, there was fighting between them almost immediately to add to all the other misery that was going around for both groups of people. Newspapers started reporting just how bad conditions were at Bosque Redondo, and the government was only able to keep the Apaches and Navajos that they had confined there, only able to keep them alive by providing them with food, since there was really none to be had naturally. So, in fact, the government, I think the number was something like $1.5 million a year the government was having to spend to keep the Navajos alive. So, that's kind of unsustainable. Therefore, with that being the situation, and with the public outcry in support of the Navajos in the newspapers back east, a treaty was signed in 1868 with the Navajos that eventually allowed them to take the long walk back home, although it was a lot less unpleasant this time. So they were able to return to their homeland and be given a reservation from within their traditional territory. Of course, I recognize how inaccurate it really is to say they were given a reservation from out of their own territory. It would be more accurate to say that they were allowed to be confined to part of their own territory. So this map is a map of the modern 21st century Navajo Nation, the Navajo Reservation, in mostly Arizona, some of New Mexico, and a little bit of Utah. This is a big chunk, actually, of their original homeland. As you can see, the Hopis are living on a reservation that is inside the Navajo reservation. Still not quite the complete gamut of their original home territory. However, unlike Bosque Redondo, even if it had been habitable, the modern-day Navajo Nation is within the square of the 4 sacred Navajo mountains. And the Mescaleros were allowed to leave the Bosque Redondo as well and have a new reservation southwest of the Bosque Redondo, a few miles, but a much more pleasant environment, which remains the home of the Mescalero Apache Nation still today. Meanwhile, what about the Chiricahua? You will recall I mentioned that when Cochise signed that treaty with the U.S. government in 1872, the Chiricahuas were given a reservation, again, allowed to have a reservation in their original territory in actually what is today Cochise County, which, as you can see, is right there in the westernmost part of the traditional Chiricahua homeland. So they were assigned that as a reservation in 1872. Cochise died in 1874 and was buried up in those mountains somewhere. And then in 1876, they were moved, and that land was taken away from them, and they were moved to the San Carlos Reservation, a little to the north. As you can see there, a little to the north, but as you can see, far enough to the north that it was no longer in traditional Chiricahua land. Instead, it was in the territory of the western Apaches and was high up in the mountains. Now, the Chiricahuas liked to have mountains handy, but they didn't necessarily like to be confined to mountains. Many of them didn't like the region, and it didn't help that they were confined there with several other Apache bands. Therefore, before very long, Chiricahuas started regularly leaving the reservation and, in fact, journeying back into their own traditional homeland and refusing to go back. And they were soon joined by some of those Chiricahuas who had gone south to Mexico for a while, but who now rejoined the other Chiricahuas north of the border. However, that is a story for a different lecture. This concludes our four-part, I think, series of lectures about the Civil War in the American West, including details about the Civil War in Indian country. So, starting next time, we are going to go back to the Northern Plains, where we had left off some time ago with the Lakota, and see what happens after the war is over.